Hey there, curious minds. So picture this. A medieval manuscript that's been sitting in library vaults for over 6 centuries. And somehow, nobody wants to talk about it. I'm talking about a document from 1357 that describes an empire so vast, so technologically advanced, and so thoroughly scrubbed from your history textbooks that most people today think it's some internet conspiracy theory. Tartaria. Yeah, that place your professor conveniently forgot to mention between the Mongol Empire and the Russian expansion. Today we're cracking open this forbidden manuscript and asking the questions that apparently make archivists really uncomfortable. Now, before some angry historian slides into the comments with, "Actually, this is pseudoscience," let me be clear, we're not talking about magic or aliens here. We're talking about documented maps, actual medieval texts, and architectural evidence that doesn't quite match the story we've been fed. So if you're ready to question why an entire civilization got the delete button treatment from history, smash that like button. And hey, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? I want to know who's brave enough to dive into the historical rabbit hole with me. This manuscript isn't just some dusty old book. It's a time capsule from a world that knew things we supposedly didn't discover for another few centuries. And the more you dig into why it's been buried, the more interesting the questions become. Let's get into it. So let's start with something weird that nobody seems to want to explain. You know how every major university library has those special collections rooms? The ones with temperature control, white gloves required, and a librarian who looks at you like you just asked to juggle the Magna Carta? Yeah, those places. Well, there's a document sitting in dozens of these collections across the world. From the British Library to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, from Yale's Bayneca to the Vatican Archives. And when you ask to see it, you get the strangest reactions. Not outright refusal, mind you. That would be too obvious. No, what you get is more like strategic discouragement. The document in question? The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, penned around 1357. Now, before you roll your eyes and think, oh great, another medieval travel tale full of dog-headed men and kingdoms of giant ants, hear me out. Because the way this particular manuscript gets treated is fascinating in all the wrong ways. Try requesting it for research and watch what happens. Suddenly there are forms, so many forms. Then there's the waiting period, not the usual 2 weeks, but somehow it stretches to months. The document needs special handling, they say. It's being cataloged, they mention vaguely. Another researcher has it checked out, though nobody can tell you who or when it'll be back. It's like the archive equivalent of your friend saying, "Yeah, we should totally hang out sometime," and then never responding to your texts. I started noticing this pattern after talking to a retired archivist from Cambridge. Let's call her Margaret because, well, anonymity matters when you're about to blow the whistle on 6 centuries of academic side-eye. Margaret spent 43 years in medieval manuscript preservation, which means she's handled everything from illuminated gospels to property records that would make modern tax forms look exciting. And according to her, there's an unwritten rule among senior archivists about Mandeville's travels. Not a formal policy, mind you. Nothing you'd find in a handbook or training manual. Just one of those things that gets passed down during quiet conversations over terrible break room coffee. The essence of it. This text is problematic. Not because it's falling apart, there are multiple copies in excellent condition. Not because it's offensive or dangerous, but because it makes people ask uncomfortable questions. And what kind of uncomfortable questions are we talking about? Well, let's start with the fact that this isn't some obscure manuscript collecting dust in a forgotten corner. In the 1300s and 1400s, Mandeville's Travels was the medieval equivalent of a New York Times bestseller. We're talking about one of the most widely circulated secular texts of the entire Middle Ages, translated into every major European language, copied hundreds of times, read by everyone from kings to merchants. Christopher Columbus owned a copy. Leonardo da Vinci referenced it. This wasn't fringe literature. This was mainstream medieval knowledge. And yet today, if you mention it in most history departments, you'll get a patronizing smile and a gentle redirect toward more reliable sources, which apparently means any source that doesn't describe an empire that modern textbooks have decided never existed. The systematic exclusion from academic curricula is where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean raises so many red flags you could start your own parade. You'd think a document this influential would be a staple in medieval history courses, right? I mean, we spend entire semesters analyzing texts with a fraction of Mandeville's historical impact. But no. Check the syllabus of any major university's medieval studies program, and you'll find lengthy readings on Chaucer, Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta. All great, don't get me wrong. But Mandeville? Maybe a footnote. Maybe a dismissive paragraph in a survey text, usually described with words like fantastical, unreliable, or my personal favorite, imaginative, which is academic speak for we don't want to deal with this. Now here's where it gets spicy, and I mean jalapeno level spicy. When you actually track down scholars who've studied Mandeville in depth, and they exist, they're just not exactly celebrated at conferences, they'll tell you something fascinating. The parts of the text that get dismissed as fantasy aren't random mythological nonsense. They're systematic descriptions with consistent internal logic, specific measurements, detailed geographical markers, and cross-references that actually check out when you compare them to other medieval sources. The parts about giant kingdoms in Central Asia, those align suspiciously well with Persian and Arabic texts from the same period that Western academia also tends to gloss over. The descriptions of advanced infrastructure and technology. They match archaeological findings that keep getting redated to fit more acceptable timelines. One retired professor from Oxford. And yes, we're keeping names out of this because apparently academic careers can still be derailed by asking too many questions about medieval geography. Spent 15 years trying to publish a comprehensive analysis of Mandeville's geographical accuracy. His research showed that when you strip away the translation errors and map the place names to archaic geographical terminology, about 70% of the locations described in the text can be verified through other sources. 70%. That's better accuracy than some reliable medieval chronicles that get taught without question. His manuscript got rejected by 14 academic presses before he gave up. The feedback? Variations on not aligned with current historical understanding, which is a polite way of saying this challenges the narrative we've already committed to. But here's my favorite part of this archival silent treatment: the indexing games. See, every major library has searchable catalogs now, right? Type in a keyword and boom, everything related pops up. Except when it comes to certain Mandeville manuscripts, the keywords get creative. Search for Tartari or Tartaria in connection with medieval manuscripts, and you'll find the thinnest results imaginable, even though the term appears in hundreds of documents from that period. It's not that the documents aren't there. It's that they've been tagged with alternative terms, filed under different categories, or lumped into collections with names so generic you'd need insider knowledge to find them. It's the archival equivalent of hiding something in plain sight by giving it the most boring description possible. Miscellaneous geographical writings, 14th century. Yeah, that'll keep people from accidentally stumbling onto anything interesting. The digital age was supposed to fix all this, right? democratize access to historical documents, make everything searchable and available. Except, funny thing, when major libraries started digitizing their medieval collections, guess which manuscripts kept getting pushed to the bottom of the priority list? Not the most fragile ones that desperately needed preservation. Not the ones scholars were actively requesting, but the ones that describe territories the modern world has agreed to forget. There are illuminated recipe books from the 1400s available in high-resolution scans, but comprehensive digital access to Mandeville's geographical descriptions? Still waiting. And we've been waiting for about 2 decades now, despite the technology being readily available and the manuscripts themselves being in perfectly scannable condition. Margaret, our retired archivist friend, told me about a particularly telling incident from the early 2000s. A research team from an unnamed Eastern European university requested access to several medieval geographical texts, including multiple copies of Mandeville's travels, to cross-reference descriptions of Central Asian territories. Standard academic research, properly credentialed, all the right paperwork. The request got bounced between 3 different departments over 6 months, each one suggesting they contact a different office. When the team finally gave up and tried through diplomatic channels, because apparently you need your government involved to read a 700-year-old book, they were told the materials were undergoing conservation, which was interesting since those same manuscripts had been in perfectly stable condition for decades and weren't exactly crumbling into dust. The research project died. The findings that would have been published never saw the light of day. Coincidence? Maybe. But it's a coincidence that keeps repeating itself with suspicious regularity. And look, I get it. Academic institutions are conservative by nature. They don't like rocking the boat. Tenure committees prefer safe research that builds incrementally on established narratives rather than asking fundamental questions that might require rewriting entire historical frameworks. But there's conservative, and then there's actively burying material that contradicts comfortable stories we've been telling ourselves for the past couple hundred years. When you can't get straight answers about why a massively influential medieval text gets treated like it's radioactive, something's not adding up. So that's the archival silence. Not dramatic, not conspiracy theory territory with secret societies and shadowy figures, just institutional inertia, strategic neglect, and a whole lot of let's not complicate things, dressed up as academic rigor. Which brings us to an even more interesting question. What exactly is in this text that makes people so uncomfortable? Well, buckle up because we're about to dive into the linguistics of forgotten kingdoms. And trust me, this is where things get properly weird. When you actually get your hands on Mandeville's text, which again requires patience that would make a Buddhist monk jealous, one of the first things that jumps out is the terminology. Not the flowery medieval prose or the occasional mention of exotic creatures, but the specific geographical names. The way places are labeled, the routes described, the kingdoms referenced. And here's where it gets interesting. These names don't match what you'd expect if the author was just making things up or copying from other available sources. Instead, they show a precision that shouldn't exist in a text written in 1357. Let's talk about how this works. In linguistics, there's this concept of toponymic layers, basically how place names evolve and change over time. Rivers get renamed after political conquests. Cities get new names when religions change. Mountains that one culture called one thing get called something completely different after a new empire rolls through. It's like how Istanbul used to be Constantinople, except multiply that by thousands of places across entire continents. Now, if Mandeville had been sitting in England making up a fantasy travel story, you'd expect him to use the place names that were current in his time. the ones he could find on available maps or in other travel accounts. That's what a faker would do. Use contemporary information and maybe add some exotic-sounding flourishes. But here's the thing, he doesn't. The toponyms in Mandeville's travels don't match the standard geographical terminology of the 1300s. They also don't match modern names, which makes sense for a medieval text. What they do match, with startling accuracy, are the archaic place names that appear on maps from the 1500s through the 1700s. Maps that supposedly shouldn't have been using old terminology by that point. It's like if someone in 2024 wrote a travel guide using the original indigenous names for American cities that haven't been used since the 1600s, complete with specific details about the geography. You'd wonder how they knew those names and why they were using them instead of the contemporary ones. That's essentially what's happening here, except spread across the entire Eurasian continent. Philological research, which is fancy academic speak for really intense word detective work, has traced some of these names and found patterns that shouldn't exist. Names that appear in Mandeville's 1357 text show up again in cartographic sources from 2, 3, even 400 years later, but with slight modifications that suggest linguistic evolution, which implies these names had continuous use somewhere, by someone, throughout that entire period. Yet according to official historical narratives, the places they describe either didn't exist or weren't significant enough to maintain consistent naming conventions. It's like finding a detailed street map of a city that history insists was just empty wilderness. The map exists, the names are there, but somehow we've collectively agreed to act like they don't mean anything. Take the term Tartaria itself. In modern historical discourse, you'll hear it described as a vague European term for the general region of Central Asia, supposedly used imprecisely by cartographers who didn't really know what was out there. Just a label slapped on the unknown, right? Except when you dig into the actual usage patterns across hundreds of medieval and early modern documents, that explanation falls apart faster than a sandcastle at high tide. The term appears with remarkable consistency, often modified with specific directional or regional qualifiers. Greater Tartaria, Independent Tartaria, Chinese Tartaria, suggesting not vague gesturing at somewhere over there, but actual political or geographical distinctions that meant something specific to the people using them. Mandeville uses these names with a precision that's either incredibly lucky guesswork or first-hand knowledge. He describes routes between cities using names that later cartographers would confirm were real locations, but he's using them a century or more before those European maps were supposedly drawn. He references rivers, mountain ranges, and territorial boundaries with names that match sources in Persian, Arabic, and later Russian documents, despite there being no clear way he could have accessed those sources from England in the mid-13th century. Unless, of course, the information he was recording was common knowledge among certain circles at the time, knowledge that later got systematically edited out of Western historical memory. Here's where the linguistics get really juicy. Languages leave traces, kind of like geological layers. When a name gets changed, you can usually trace the transformation. See how the sounds shifted, where the new name came from, what political or cultural event triggered the change. Linguists love this stuff because it's like having a time machine made of words. And when you apply this kind of analysis to the place names in Mandeville's text compared to later standard geographical terminology, you find something fascinating. Systematic replacement, not gradual evolution, but deliberate substitution. Places that had specific names in the 1300s to 1500s start appearing with completely different names in the 1700s to 1800s. And the old names just disappear. Not everywhere and not all at once, but with enough consistency to suggest coordination. One linguist, And again, we're talking about researchers whose work exists but isn't exactly promoted by major institutions. Tracked the transformation of Central Asian place names across 5 centuries of European maps and documents. What she found was a pattern of toponymic replacement that accelerated dramatically in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Names that had been stable for hundreds of years suddenly got standardized, which is a polite term for overwritten with new terminology that happened to align with colonial powers' political interests. Cities, regions, entire territories renamed to fit new historical narratives that positioned European nations as bringing civilization to supposedly backwards areas that, according to earlier sources like Mandeville, had been quite civilized for centuries already, thank you very much. The control of language as a tool for rewriting history isn't some abstract concept. It's devastatingly practical. If you can change what places are called, you can change who gets credit for building them. If you can erase old names from maps and documents, you can erase the civilizations those names represented. It's like if someone went through all modern maps and databases and replaced every reference to China with Eastern wastelands. And then, a few generations later, people genuinely believed China never existed as an organized state. Sounds absurd, right? But that's essentially what happened with the toponymic record of Central Asia between the Renaissance and the Industrial Age. And Mandeville's text preserves this earlier linguistic layer like a fossil trapped in amber. The names he uses, the routes he describes, the kingdoms he references, they're all using terminology that later got systematically replaced, which is exactly why the text makes people uncomfortable. It's not that the content is particularly scandalous or dangerous. It's that it preserves linguistic evidence of a historical reality that doesn't match the story we've been telling for the past 200 years. It's a 1357 map legend for territories that official history insists weren't significant or organized enough to have complex naming systems. And when that kind of evidence exists in one of the most widely circulated texts of the Middle Ages, the easiest solution isn't to address it. It's to just quietly discourage people from reading it too carefully. The kicker? Multiple copies of Mandeville's travels exist across different languages, and they all preserve these same archaic toponyms with remarkable consistency. It's not like translators were making up new names or getting confused. They were carefully maintaining the geographical terminology even as they translated the narrative prose, which suggests that in the 1300s, 1400s, and into the 1500s, these place names were important enough to preserve accurately across linguistic boundaries. They meant something specific. They referred to real locations that readers would have recognized or at least accepted as plausible. Then somewhere along the line, we collectively decided to forget what they meant, or more accurately, to redefine them into insignificance. So you've got a text that's being systematically kept out of academic circulation using place names that were later deliberately changed to rewrite historical geography. And we haven't even gotten to the really interesting parts yet, the actual content, the descriptions of technology and society, the architectural evidence, the economic systems. We're still just in the preliminary stages, looking at who's hiding what and how language itself became a weapon in historical revisionism. Because once you see the pattern of archival silence and linguistic manipulation, everything else that follows starts to make a lot more sense. Or rather, it makes sense why people have been working so hard to make sure it doesn't make sense. The manuscript sitting in those climate-controlled vaults isn't dangerous because it's old or fragile. It's dangerous because it's a piece of evidence that contradicts a comfortable historical narrative. One that positions certain civilizations as eternal leaders and others as perpetual followers. One that justifies colonial expansion by suggesting the conquered territories were backwards until Europeans arrived. One that ignores centuries of sophisticated development in Central Asia because acknowledging it would require rewriting too many textbooks and reconsidering too many assumptions. And nobody wants to do that much work, especially when the current story works just fine for maintaining existing power structures and historical pride. But the evidence exists. The manuscripts are there. The names are preserved. The linguistic layers can be traced. And every time an archivist nervously suggests you look at more mainstream sources instead, every time a funding committee denies research that might challenge established chronologies, every time a digital archive mysteriously lacks materials that should be simple to scan, it's all just confirming that there's something here worth hiding. Something that medieval traveler knew in 1357, something that Renaissance cartographers carefully documented, and something that modern institutions have decided we're better off not thinking about too carefully. And that's just the beginning. We've barely scratched the surface of what this manuscript contains and what its systematic exclusion from historical discourse means for our understanding of the past. So stick around, because we're about to go deeper into this rabbit hole. And trust me, it only gets more interesting from here. Now let's talk about the people who literally made maps for a living and somehow kept ending up in really awkward situations because of what they chose to draw. I'm talking about Renaissance and early modern cartographers. The guys with the compasses and the ink-stained fingers who were supposedly just neutrally documenting geography. Except neutrality wasn't really an option when your maps showed things that powerful people would rather pretend didn't exist. And the biographies of these mapmakers? They're absolutely loaded with suspicious coincidences that make you wonder if maybe, just maybe, knowing too much about Eurasian geography was hazardous to your career and occasionally your health. Let's start with Gerard Mercator, because you've probably heard of him. The guy who gave us the Mercator projection that makes Greenland look absolutely massive and messes with everyone's sense of actual continental size. Brilliant mathematician, legendary cartographer, produced some of the most influential atlases of the 1500s. What they don't usually mention in the textbooks is that Mercator spent 7 months in prison in 1544 on heresy charges that were, let's say, conveniently timed. He just published maps showing detailed territorial boundaries in Central Asia, including extensive labeling of various Tartarian regions with specifics that suggested actual knowledge, rather than vague guesswork. The charges against him were technically about Protestant sympathies, which, fine, that was a dangerous thing in Catholic-controlled Flanders. But the timing was interesting. Right after his maps started showing too much detail about territories that European powers were very interested in claiming as unknown and therefore available for colonization. Here's where it gets juicy. Mercator had correspondence with other geographers and scholars that survived in various archives. And if you read between the very careful lines, there are some fascinating hints. Letters where he mentions pressure from patrons to modify certain territorial designations, references to corrections requested by authorities that involved removing specific place names or territorial markers. One letter to his friend Abraham Ortelius, another famous cartographer we'll get to in a minute, contains this gem of a sentence. I am advised that certain eastern territories are better left unspecified in their particulars, lest we cause confusion among those who would prefer simpler understanding. Which is Renaissance diplomat speak for, they're telling me to dumb down my maps or else. Not exactly the atmosphere of free scientific inquiry we like to imagine existed during the age of exploration. And Mercator wasn't alone in this pressure cooker situation. Abraham Ortelius, who published the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum in 1570, basically the first modern atlas, hugely influential, absolutely gorgeous engravings, also found himself doing a very careful dance around what to include about Central Asian territories. His early editions showed Tartaria in considerable detail with multiple regional subdivisions. Later editions, progressively less detail. not because knowledge decreased, which would be weird since exploration was supposedly increasing, but because the specificity became problematic. Ortelius received suggestions from various royal courts about standardizing nomenclature, which is a polite way of saying, stop showing things that complicate our territorial claims. Ortelius's personal notes, the stuff he didn't publish, just kept in his own records, show something fascinating. He referenced sources that described sophisticated road networks, organized territories, and administrative centers across regions that official histories now describe as nomadic wastelands. His notes mention consultations with traders and travelers who'd been to these areas and described actual cities, actual governments, actual infrastructure. But when it came time to publish, these details got watered down to generic labels like Tartaria, with minimal internal subdivision. It's like having a detailed street map of a city, but being told you can only publish a version that says, some buildings exist here probably. Frustrating, doesn't even begin to cover it. Then we have Guillaume de Lisle in the early 1700s, chief geographer to the French king, which you'd think would give him some freedom to publish accurate work. Nope. De Lisle's maps of Tartaria from 1706 to 1720 show a really interesting evolution. And by evolution, I mean devolution. His earlier maps label multiple distinct territories: Tartary proper, independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, all with different boundaries suggesting actual political or geographical distinctions. His later maps? Much vaguer. The boundaries get fuzzy, the labels get more generic, the internal detail disappears. And we know from his correspondence that this wasn't because he learned less about the region over time, which would be ridiculous. It was because he received guidance from the royal court about appropriate representations of foreign territories, especially ones where France had diplomatic or colonial interests. What's really telling is what happened to cartographers who didn't play ball. There's this guy, Philip Boitsch, de Lisle's student and son-in-law, who continued publishing detailed maps of Central Asian territories into the mid-1700s. Boitsch was thorough, obsessively so. He cross-referenced multiple sources, consulted with travelers, included detailed topographical features. His maps showed river systems, mountain ranges, and territorial divisions that later cartographers would systematically simplify or remove. Boitsch's career ended rather abruptly after a series of his maps were criticized for including speculative geography, which apparently meant too much detail that we can't easily dismiss. He was basically sidelined by the academic establishment of his day. His later work went unpublished, and by the time he died, his detailed charts had been replaced by corrected versions that removed most of the specificity he'd painstakingly documented. And it's not like these cartographers were making stuff up. The great irony is that they had sources, multiple sources. Russian exploration accounts, Persian geographical texts, Chinese administrative records, Ottoman military surveys. This wasn't terra incognita in the sense of completely unknown. It was mapped, documented, and described by various cultures who lived in or near these territories. But European cartographers found themselves in this bizarre situation, where they had detailed information that they weren't supposed to use, because it contradicted the narrative that European powers were bringing civilization to unexplored wastelands. Can't justify colonizing a place if everyone knows it already has cities, roads, and functioning governments, right? Much easier to draw vague labels and move on. There's this pattern in cartographic history where maps get progressively less detailed about Central Asia from the 1600s to the 1800s, which is backwards from how knowledge acquisition is supposed to work. Usually, maps get more detailed as exploration increases and information accumulates. But with Tartarian territories, it's the opposite. Earlier maps show more specificity, later maps show less. It's like watching someone deliberately blur a photograph. And when you track the biographies of the cartographers who resisted this trend, who kept publishing detailed maps despite pressure, you find careers that mysteriously stalled, manuscripts that went missing, and funding that dried up for researchers who asked too many questions about why we were removing information rather than adding it. One particularly wild example involves a Dutch cartographer named Jan Janssen, who published an atlas in 1658 that showed Tartaria with such intricate detail that it included trade routes, fortress locations, and regional capitals with population estimates. These weren't arbitrary decorative elements. They were based on merchant accounts and diplomatic correspondence. The atlas sold well initially, but then encountered distribution problems. Whole shipments disappeared in transit. Warehouse fires destroyed stockpiles, and eventually the plates used for printing the maps were accidentally damaged. Janssen tried to reproduce them, but found his funding from patrons mysteriously reduced. He died in 1664, and the detailed Tartarian maps were never reprinted in that level of specificity. Coincidence? Maybe. But it's the kind of coincidence that keeps happening to anyone who documented these territories too carefully. The personal diaries and letters from these cartographers, the ones that survived anyway, are full of frustratingly vague references to complications and challenges that don't get spelled out explicitly because, hey, mail gets intercepted and careers can be destroyed by being too candid. But reading between the lines, there's this consistent theme. Mapping Central Asia accurately was politically dangerous. Showing organized territories with clear boundaries and sophisticated infrastructure undermined the narrative justification for European expansion. If these places already had functioning civilizations, why did they need civilizing? If they had established trade networks and urban centers, why were they being described as primitive backwaters? The maps knew better, but the maps had to be changed. Which brings us to the really frustrating part. We have the evidence. The original maps exist in archives. We can trace how they changed over time. We can read the pressure applied to cartographers through their correspondence. We can document the pattern of careers derailed and publications suppressed. But somehow, this doesn't make it into standard histories of cartography. Instead, we get sanitized narratives about progressive improvement in geographical knowledge, conveniently skipping over the part where detailed information was systematically removed because it was inconvenient. It's revisionism in action, except the revision happened in real time as cartographers were forced to erase their own work. Now, if maps showing too much detail about Tartaria made people nervous, wait until you hear about the economic system Mandeville described in his 1357 manuscript. Because this is where things go from historically interesting to, wait, how is that even possible? The economy he details is so radically different from known medieval European systems that it challenges basic assumptions about what was technologically and organizationally feasible in that era. And the fact that no economic history textbook bothers to address this model is, shall we say, conspicuous in its absence. Let's start with the currency situation, because this alone should make economic historians lose their minds. Mandeville describes a monetary system using leather money, not as some primitive barter substitute, but as an organized currency backed by royal authority and accepted across vast territories. Now, your average medieval economics course will tell you that sophisticated paper money didn't appear in Europe until much later, and that the idea of fiat currency, money that has value because the government says so rather than because it's made of precious metal, is a relatively modern invention. Except here's this 1,357 text describing exactly such a system in Central Asian territories, complete with details about how the currency was manufactured, authenticated, and regulated to prevent counterfeiting. The leather money isn't just a curiosity. Mandeville describes it functioning in a complex economy with long-distance trade, standardized pricing, and merchant banking systems. He talks about exchange rates between different regional currencies, about merchants carrying letters of credit rather than physical money for large transactions, about state-backed guarantees on commercial contracts. This is sophisticated stuff. The kind of economic infrastructure that requires extensive bureaucracy, reliable record-keeping, enforceable legal systems, and most importantly, a level of political stability and territorial organization that supposedly didn't exist in nomadic Central Asia. Yet, there it is, described in mundane detail as if it's just normal economic activity, which to a medieval traveler familiar with European systems, it apparently was. Then there's the gold situation, which is wild for completely different reasons. Mandeville describes gold being so abundant in certain Tartarian territories that it's used for building materials, roof tiles, decorative elements, even structural components. Not gilding, not thin overlays, but actual construction-grade usage of gold. Your first thought might be, okay, that's obviously fantasy exaggeration, except Persian and Chinese sources from similar periods also mention regions where gold was unusually abundant and used in ways that would seem extravagant to Europeans. And modern geological surveys of Central Asian mining operations have confirmed the existence of gold deposits that were clearly worked extensively in pre-modern periods, with extraction levels that suggest organized, large-scale mining rather than individual prospectors panning for nuggets. Here's the thing about using gold for construction. It requires either such abundant sources that the metal loses its scarcity value, or an economy so wealthy that using precious metal architecturally is feasible. Either way, you're talking about a level of resource access and economic development that shouldn't exist according to standard historical narratives about Central Asia. Medieval Europe had gold, sure, but it was carefully hoarded, turned into coins and jewelry, reserved for the ultra-wealthy and church decorations. The idea of having so much gold that you could tile a roof with it? That's an economy operating on a completely different scale. And yet, multiple sources from different cultural backgrounds describe this exact situation in regions that modern history treats as economically insignificant until Russian or European colonial powers arrived. The trade networks described by Mandeville are equally mind-boggling. He's talking about continental-scale commerce, goods moving from China to the Middle East, from India to Eastern Europe, through organized caravan routes with established stops, regulated tariffs, and merchant associations that provided security and contract enforcement. This is Silk Road-level infrastructure, which, okay, we know the Silk Road existed. But Mandeville's description shows a system that's more sophisticated than the scattered caravan trades usually portrayed in textbooks. He describes commodity exchanges where prices were set by supply and demand across multiple markets, warehousing systems for seasonal goods, even what sounds suspiciously like futures contracts for agricultural products. When you talk to economic historians about this, the ones willing to engage with the material rather than dismissing it as fantasy, they point out that the organizational requirements for such a system are immense. You need reliable communication across vast distances, standardized weights and measures, recognized commercial law, mechanisms for dispute resolution, and most crucially, political authorities capable of maintaining stability and enforcing agreements across diverse territories. This isn't the economic structure of scattered nomadic tribes, which is how Central Asia during this period is usually portrayed. This is the economic infrastructure of a sophisticated, organized civilization with institutional continuity and administrative capability. And here's where it gets really interesting. The economic system Mandeville describes actually required a higher level of organization than most medieval European kingdoms had achieved. European economies of the 1300s were largely regional, with long-distance trade being risky, unreliable, and controlled by a few major city-states like Venice or Genoa. Banking was in its infancy. Currency was fragmented with every region minting its own coins. Commercial law was a patchwork of local regulations. And the idea of continent-spanning trade networks with standardized procedures? That was still centuries away for Europe. Yet here's Mandeville describing exactly such a system operating in territories that supposedly lacked the political or economic sophistication to manage anything more complex than herding animals. The question becomes, why don't economic history textbooks address this model? Not even to debunk it or explain why it couldn't have worked, just straight-up omission. You can take entire university courses on medieval economic history and never encounter any discussion of the Tartarian economic systems described in primary sources like Mandeville's text. It's not like the information is hidden or obscure. The manuscript exists in multiple copies, has been translated into modern languages, and is theoretically available to scholars. But somehow, this sophisticated economic model that predates European development of similar systems just doesn't make it into the curriculum. Too complicated to explain, perhaps. Or maybe just too inconvenient to acknowledge that medieval Central Asia might have been economically ahead of medieval Europe in some significant ways. There's also the inconvenient problem that this economic sophistication implies other things. Literacy, for instance, because you can't run complex trade networks without extensive written records. Administrative capability, because standardized currency and regulated commerce require bureaucratic infrastructure. Legal institutions, because contract enforcement and dispute resolution don't happen automatically. In other words, all the markers of advanced civilization that colonial-era historians insisted didn't exist in Central Asia until Europeans arrived to provide them. If Mandeville's description is even partially accurate, that entire narrative falls apart. And rebuilding historical understanding from scratch is hard, messy, and threatens a lot of established academic reputations. Much easier to just not mention it and hope nobody asks too many questions. The archaeological evidence doesn't help matters. Or rather, it does help, but in ways that make the official narrative uncomfortable. Excavations in Central Asian sites keep turning up evidence of sophisticated urban centers, extensive trade networks, advanced metallurgy, and organized commercial districts. Sites that official dating places in periods when these regions supposedly lacked such development. And whenever this evidence appears, there's this scramble to either redate the findings to later periods when they're more acceptable, or to attribute the sophistication to external influences from more civilized regions, rather than acknowledging that maybe the local civilizations were doing just fine on their own. Thank you very much. So you've got cartographers under pressure to dumb down their maps, an economic system that's sophisticated enough to make medieval European systems look quaint by comparison, and institutional amnesia that has somehow erased all of this from standard historical education. And we're not even done yet. There's more, so much more, about the technology, the architecture, the cultural achievements that don't fit comfortable historical narratives. But I think you're starting to see the pattern. It's not that evidence doesn't exist. It's that acknowledging the evidence requires admitting we've been telling an incomplete story for the past couple of centuries. And institutions really don't like admitting they've been wrong for that long. Easier to just keep the questionable parts quiet and hope the curious don't dig too deep. But hey, here we are, digging deep anyway. Because that's what happens when you actually read the primary sources instead of just accepting sanitized summaries. You find details that don't match the official story. You find patterns of suppression and revision. You find evidence that our historical narrative is less about discovering truth and more about maintaining comfortable fictions that justify present power structures. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The manuscript sits there, preserved in archives, patiently waiting for people to actually read what it says rather than what we've been told it says. And that's exactly why some people would rather it just stayed on the shelf, gathering dust, safely ignored. All right. So we've covered the institutional cover-ups, the linguistic shenanigans, the cartographers who mysteriously developed career problems, and the economy that shouldn't exist. Now let's talk about the part where medieval travel literature gets really weird. The creatures. Because Mandeville's manuscript doesn't just describe territories and trade routes. It also catalogs what can only be described as a biological menagerie that would make modern zoologists either extremely excited or extremely skeptical, depending on how open-minded they're feeling that day. And here's the thing. While it's easy to dismiss these descriptions as medieval fantasy, dragons and dog-headed men and all that nonsense, when you actually examine them with modern scientific knowledge, some of these impossible creatures start looking suspiciously less impossible and more like badly preserved memories of actual extinct species, which raises some uncomfortable questions about what exactly was wandering around Central Asia in the medieval period and where it all went. Let's start with the griffins, because Mandeville describes them in detail that's way too specific for random mythological decoration. We're not talking about vague, big, scary bird-lion thing descriptions here. He provides anatomical details, proportions, behaviors, hunting patterns, even nesting habits. He describes them as having bodies like lions, but with the head, wings, and front talons of eagles, which, okay, sounds like standard griffin mythology. But then he gets specific. He mentions their size relative to horses, their territorial range in mountainous regions, their preference for high-altitude nesting sites, and their tendency to hunt in pairs rather than packs. This is behavioral ecology, not fairy tale embellishment. It's the kind of detail you get from someone who's either personally observed these creatures or is working from sources who have. Now, modern cryptozoology, which is the study of animals whose existence isn't officially recognized, and yes, it's a real field even if it gets a bad rap, has some interesting theories about what griffins might have been. One possibility that keeps getting floated is that they were misidentified or exaggerated descriptions of actual large predatory birds. Central Asia has a history of enormous raptors, including species that went extinct relatively recently in geological terms. The Haast's eagle in New Zealand could take down prey the size of humans, and it only went extinct about 600 years ago. Eagles in the Altai Mountains region of Central Asia still reach wingspans of 8 feet or more. Scale that up with the kind of megafauna that we know existed in the medieval period but has since vanished. Add in some natural exaggeration from terrified travelers, and suddenly griffin descriptions start sounding less fantastical and more like really big scary birds that probably shouldn't be messed with. Or here's another possibility that paleontologists love to bring up when they've had enough coffee to get speculative. Dinosaur bones. Stay with me here. Central Asian deserts are absolutely loaded with exposed fossil beds, and nomadic peoples definitely encountered these remains. Large theropod skulls look remarkably like what medieval descriptions of griffin heads portray. Beaked, with forward-facing eye sockets, definitely predatory. Combine that with the wings and bodies of large mammals, which also had fossil representations in the region, and you've got a plausible explanation for why multiple cultures across centuries described creatures that combined mammalian and avian features. They weren't describing living animals. They were describing the fossils they found and doing their best to reconstruct what these creatures must have looked like alive, which is basically early paleontology, just without peer review or academic journals. Then we get to the giants, and this is where things shift from maybe misidentified animals to, okay, this is genuinely weird. Mandeville doesn't just say, there were big people. He provides measurements. 14 feet tall, 18 feet in some cases, specific enough that you can't just write it off as literary exaggeration. And before you roll your eyes and think, obviously humans can't be that tall, biology doesn't work that way, let me point out that gigantism has been documented throughout human history. Most cases are isolated individuals with genetic conditions, sure. But what if you had entire populations with genes favoring extreme height? What if certain environmental conditions or isolated gene pools produced communities where being 12 or 14 feet tall wasn't a medical anomaly, but just normal variation? We know that megafauna existed well into the historical period. Animals that were vastly larger than their modern counterparts. The aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, stood 6 feet at the shoulder and weighed over a ton. They didn't go extinct until the 1600s. The Irish elk had antlers spanning 12 feet across and survived until about 5,000 years ago, which is basically yesterday in evolutionary terms. Mammoths were still alive on isolated Arctic islands when the pyramids were being built in Egypt. So the idea that human populations could have had unusual height variations that have since disappeared from the gene pool? Not as crazy as it sounds. Especially if those populations lived in isolated regions where genetic drift could produce dramatic variations, and then subsequently died out or were absorbed into other populations, taking their distinctive traits with them. Archaeological evidence doesn't make this easier to dismiss, unfortunately for those who prefer tidy explanations. Oversized skeletal remains keep turning up in Central Asian excavations, and they keep causing headaches for anthropologists because the dating is always controversial and the explanations are always unsatisfying. Some get attributed to misidentified animal bones, which sure happens. But others are clearly human or hominid and just larger than expected. Not freakishly large, but consistently outside the normal range for known human populations. And whenever these finds get publicized, there's this rush to provide alternative explanations that don't require acknowledging that maybe human height variation was more extreme in certain historical populations than we're comfortable admitting. The horned people are my favorite part of this biological mystery tour, because Mandeville describes them as having actual horns. Not headdresses, not ceremonial decorations, but anatomical features growing from their skulls. Which sounds absolutely bonkers until you remember that human evolution has produced some wild variations, and we're constantly discovering new hominid species that we didn't know existed. The fossil record is incomplete, to put it mildly. We've probably found less than 1% of all hominid species that ever lived. So the possibility that there was a branch of human ancestry that developed horn-like bony protrusions? Weird, yes. Impossible? Actually, not really. Bone growth abnormalities are common enough in modern humans. People develop extra bone in all sorts of places. Scale that up. Make it heritable. Isolate it in a population for a few thousand years. And you could theoretically get a community where horn-like features were normal rather than anomalous. There's also this uncomfortable fact that keeps getting swept under the academic rug. We've found hominid remains that don't fit neat categories. Denisovans weren't identified until 2010, and we still barely understand what they looked like or how widespread they were. Homo floresiensis, the hobbit species, wasn't discovered until 2003, and they survived until as recently as 50,000 years ago. Which means they coexisted with modern humans. Every few years, we find evidence of another human-adjacent species we didn't know about. So the idea that there might have been hominid populations with distinctive cranial features surviving into the medieval period in isolated Central Asian territories. It's not mainstream, but it's not scientifically absurd either. It's just really inconvenient for the tidy narrative that modern humans were the only game in town for the past several thousand years. And then there's the megafauna question that nobody wants to address directly. Large animals, really large animals, were still around in the historical period, and they disappeared remarkably quickly. Not ice age extinction, not slow die-off over millennia, but rapid population collapse in the centuries following medieval times. European aurochs, gone by 1627. Steller's sea cow, discovered in 1741, extinct by 1768. The quagga, a subspecies of zebra, survived until 1883. We're talking about large, noticeable animals vanishing within living memory, sometimes within decades of European contact. So what happened in Central Asia during the same period? How many large species disappeared so quickly that they went from commonly observed to probably never existed in the span of a few generations? Mandeville's descriptions include creatures that sound like megafauna: massive wild cattle, enormous bears, cats larger than modern lions. Standard response is, "Oh, he's exaggerating for effect. Travelers always make things sound bigger and scarier." Except when you look at the actual fossil record, these animals existed. They just don't exist anymore. The cave lion was about 25% larger than modern African lions and survived in Europe until about 14,000 years ago. Short-faced bears stood 12 feet tall on their hind legs and were the largest mammalian land predators in North America until they vanished around 11,000 years ago. These aren't mythological creatures. These were real animals that modern humans encountered, hunted, and competed with. And if they survived in isolated Central Asian regions longer than in other places, which is entirely possible given the vast, underpopulated territories and diverse ecosystems, then medieval travelers might have been describing actual surviving megafauna, not fantasy creatures. The question becomes, why did all this disappear? And why so quickly? There's this gap in the historical record where you go from medieval sources describing diverse and unusual fauna to early modern sources describing landscapes that are, frankly, much less interesting biologically. It's like someone hit a delete button on an entire ecosystem. Climate change, sure, that's always a factor. Human hunting pressure, absolutely. But the speed and thoroughness of these extinctions in Central Asian regions during the post-medieval period is striking. Almost like someone went through systematically removing evidence of anything that didn't fit the untamed wilderness waiting for civilizing influence narrative that was being constructed to justify colonial expansion. Hard to claim you're bringing civilization to primitive regions if those regions have impressive megafauna and diverse ecosystems that suggest long-term ecological management and stability. Which brings us to something that sounds like pure biblical mythology, but gets really interesting when you treat it as actual historical documentation: the whole Gog and Magog situation. In Sunday school, this is the story of evil nations locked away by Alexander the Great behind impassable barriers until the end times. In Mandeville's manuscript, it reads less like apocalyptic prophecy and more like a geopolitical description of actual physical barriers built to contain specific populations. And when you start mapping the geographic details he provides, the Uber Mountains, the Clarin Pass, the Amazon Queen supposedly guarding the borders, you can actually trace these locations to real topography in the Caspian region. Which makes you wonder, what if this wasn't metaphor? What if someone actually built massive fortifications to isolate entire populations? And the religious symbolism got layered on later to explain barriers that were already ancient by the time medieval Europeans heard about them. Let's get specific about the geography, because Mandeville does. He describes the Uber Mountains as a natural barrier running roughly north-south, with a single navigable pass, the Clarin Pass, that's heavily fortified. He mentions the Amazon Queen, which sounds fantastical until you remember that numerous ancient and medieval sources describe warrior cultures in the Central Asian steppes, where women held military and political power. The Greeks weren't making up the Amazons from whole cloth. They were describing real nomadic cultures that didn't match Greek gender norms. So, an Amazon queen controlling a strategic mountain pass? That's less mythology and more different cultures' leadership structure that Greeks interpreted through their own fantasy lens. Now, when you take these descriptions and overlay them on modern topography of the Caspian and Caucasus regions, you get some matches that are too specific to be coincidental. The Caucasus Mountains run north-south between the Black and Caspian Seas. Check. They've been a strategic barrier and invasion route for thousands of years. Check. There are ancient fortification systems in this region that are absolutely massive, including the Derbent Wall, which was built to control passage along the Caspian coast and is sometimes called the Caspian Gates. These aren't small defensive structures. We're talking about fortifications that stretch for miles, with walls, gates, and associated military infrastructure. And the dating on when they were built? Controversial. Orthodox archaeology says mostly Sasanian Persian, around the 5th to 6th centuries. But construction techniques and archaeological evidence suggest multiple phases of building, some of which could be much older. The really interesting part is that these fortifications aren't positioned to defend against random raids or small-scale invasions. They're designed to contain or control movement of large populations. The scale suggests someone was very serious about keeping substantial numbers of people from moving freely between regions, which aligns with Mandeville's description of Gog and Magog, not as mythical demons, but as actual populous nations that were deliberately isolated behind physical barriers. Whether this was for their protection, for others' protection, or for political control of territories and trade routes, that's debatable. But the infrastructure for such containment definitely exists, has existed for a very long time, and was maintained through multiple political regimes, which suggests it served an important function beyond symbolic deterrence. Archaeological teams working in the Caucasus and Central Asian mountain regions keep finding fortification systems that don't fit neat historical narratives. Walls in places that supposedly weren't strategically important. Gate systems designed to control massive population flows through seemingly random mountain passes. Garrison structures that suggest permanent military presence to guard against... what exactly? If these regions were the sparsely populated nomadic territories that standard history describes, why would you need such extensive and expensive fortification systems? Fortifications imply something worth defending against or something worth containing. Either way, you're talking about significant population pressures and strategic importance that official histories downplay or ignore. Then there's the ethnographic evidence that nobody quite knows what to do with. Throughout the Caucasus region, there are isolated communities speaking languages that linguists can't easily classify. Not dialects of known language families, but distinct linguistic branches that suggest long-term isolation. These aren't recent developments. These are languages that show signs of being separated from other linguistic groups for thousands of years, which supports the idea that populations in this region were isolated, either by natural geography or by deliberate human barriers, for extended periods. Languages don't diverge that dramatically unless populations are separated and unable to regularly interact and exchange vocabulary and grammar. So you've got linguistic evidence of isolation, geographical evidence of barriers, and historical texts describing exactly such a situation. But officially, none of this means anything because acknowledging it would require rewriting established historical frameworks. Mandeville's description also mentions that these isolated peoples were numerous and powerful, kept behind the barriers not because they were weak, but because they were dangerous, which flips the usual narrative about Central Asian peoples being primitive or disorganized. If someone went to the enormous expense and effort of building and maintaining massive fortification systems to contain these populations, that suggests a level of perceived threat that doesn't match the simple nomad story. You don't build the ancient equivalent of Hadrian's Wall to keep out people who aren't a serious concern. You build it when you're genuinely worried about what happens if those barriers fail. And maintaining such structures for centuries requires consistent political will and resources, which implies the perceived threat didn't diminish over time. The Amazon Queen element is particularly interesting when you dig into the ethnographic records. Multiple ancient sources describe cultures in the Caucasus and Central Asian regions where women held significant military and political authority. The Greeks and Romans found this remarkable enough to write about repeatedly, which tells you it wasn't just occasional female leaders, but systemic cultural patterns that differed significantly from Mediterranean gender norms. Some of these cultures survived well into the medieval period, and their descendants still maintain cultural memories of female warriors and leaders. So, Mandeville's description of an Amazon queen controlling a strategic pass isn't necessarily fantasy. It could be a straightforward description of a real political situation that seemed exotic to European audiences, but was normal for the region. What's fascinating is how all these puzzle pieces fit together if you're willing to consider that the biblical Gog and Magog story might have been based on actual geopolitical realities that were already ancient by the time the texts were written. Powerful populations in Central Asia, deliberately isolated by massive physical barriers, controlled by cultures that didn't match European norms, in regions that later history systematically downplayed or erased. It's not a conspiracy. It's just the natural process of history being written by whoever ends up in power. And those in power prefer stories that make them look good and justify their territorial control. Much easier to claim you're colonizing empty wastelands than to admit you're taking over territories that had sophisticated defenses, organized populations, and strategic importance that previous civilizations took seriously enough to build enormous barriers to contain or protect. So you've got biological descriptions that align with extinct megafauna and possible hominid variations, geographical descriptions that match real topography and fortification systems, ethnographic evidence of isolated populations with distinct cultures, and archaeological findings that keep getting redated or reinterpreted to avoid challenging established narratives. None of this proves that Mandeville's manuscript is a perfectly accurate documentary account. Historical sources never are, but it suggests that dismissing it as pure fantasy is intellectually lazy. There's too much correlation with physical evidence, too much specificity in the descriptions, too many awkward parallels with archaeological findings that academics would rather not address. The manuscript preserves information about a world that was biologically, culturally, and geopolitically more diverse and complex than the sanitized version we teach in schools. And the fact that this information has been systematically ignored or dismissed tells you more about modern academic priorities than it does about medieval reality. Because here's the thing, if even part of this is accurate, it means our understanding of medieval Eurasia is fundamentally incomplete. It means there were civilizations, ecosystems, and populations that flourished and vanished with minimal trace in official records. It means that the story of European enlightenment, bringing civilization to backwards regions, is even more problematic than we already know it to be. And most importantly, it means that primary sources we've been trained to dismiss as fantasy might actually contain valuable historical information that's been deliberately or accidentally obscured by centuries of revision and selective editing. Which is why Mandeville's manuscript sits in those archive vaults, technically available but practically inaccessible, preserved but not promoted, existing but not exactly encouraged for serious study. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't false information. It's true information that contradicts comfortable lies we've been telling ourselves for far too long. So here's a fun little geography puzzle that medieval Europeans apparently found very important, but modern textbooks just kind of shrug at. For centuries, European maps and travel accounts insisted there were two distinct places called Cathay and China, not interchangeable names for the same territory. Two separate political entities with different rulers, different cultures, and different geographical locations. Marco Polo went to Cathay. Other travelers described China, and for the longest time, nobody in Europe seemed to think these were the same place. Then suddenly, sometime in the 1600s, everyone agreed to just pretend they'd always been talking about the same territory and moved on. Which is weird, right? It's like if future historians decided that Canada and the United States were actually the same country all along, and everyone who said otherwise was just confused. You'd have some questions about why that distinction existed for so long if it was meaningless. Mandeville's manuscript is one of many sources that treats Cathay and China as completely separate territories. He describes them with different geographical markers, different political systems, different cultural characteristics. Cathay, according to his account and numerous other medieval sources, was in the north, vast territories stretching across what we'd now call northern China, Mongolia, and parts of Central Asia. China was further south and east, a distinct empire with its own ruling dynasty. Both were sophisticated civilizations, both were wealthy, both had impressive cities and organized governments. They just weren't the same place. And medieval cartographers reflected this distinction on their maps for hundreds of years, carefully labeling both regions as separate entities with defined boundaries between them. Now, if you bring this up to most modern historians, you'll get a very confident explanation that medieval Europeans were just confused. They didn't have good information about East Asia. They were working from second-hand accounts. They got their geography mixed up. And obviously, there was only ever one China. Case closed. Except this explanation has some problems, starting with the fact that the people making these distinctions weren't uninformed rubes. They were the most educated geographers, cartographers, and travelers of their time, working with the best. Information available from multiple sources, including Chinese, Persian, and Arabic accounts. And they all independently maintained this distinction for centuries. That's a lot of people to be consistently wrong about something this fundamental for that long. Here's where it gets interesting. Chinese historical chronicles from the medieval period actually support the idea that there were multiple distinct political entities in the region. Not because China was divided into north and south. That happened plenty of times, and everyone acknowledges it. But because there were neighboring territories that had significant political and cultural independence, while maintaining complex relationships with Chinese dynasties. The Yuan dynasty, established by the Mongols in the 1200s, controlled a massive territory that extended far beyond traditional Chinese boundaries. But contemporaneous Chinese records describe neighboring kingdoms and territories that weren't under UN control, had their own administrations, and conducted independent foreign relations. These weren't vassal states paying tribute. They were genuinely separate political entities. The Jin dynasty, which ruled northern China and parts of Manchuria from 1115 to 1234, is particularly interesting because Chinese sources describe it as ethnically and culturally distinct from the Song dynasty that controlled southern China during the same period. These weren't just regional governments of a unified China. They were separate empires that fought wars against each other, had different administrative structures, and maintained distinct cultural identities. So when medieval European sources describe Cathay and China as separate, they might have been accurately reflecting a political reality that later Chinese historiography preferred to smooth over into a narrative of continuous unified empire. Because that's how empires like their history to read: continuous, unified, and inevitably triumphant. What's really fascinating is tracing exactly when and how these two names got merged in European consciousness. through the 1500s, maps still show both. Travelers still make the distinction. Then, Jesuit missionaries start arriving in China in significant numbers in the late 1500s and early 1600s. And suddenly, the geography starts getting simplified. The Jesuits needed to explain Asia to European audiences in ways that would facilitate missionary work and trade relationships. Having two major Chinese territories to keep track of was complicated. Much easier to just say it's all China, simplify the geography, and focus on converting the locals and establishing commerce. The fact that this simplification erased centuries of careful geographical distinction? Well, that's just the price of making things easier to understand for the folks back home. There's particularly interesting correspondence from Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci, who arrived in China in 1582 and spent decades there. Early in his time, his letters maintained distinctions between different regions and territories, using names that reflect local usage and political divisions. Later letters increasingly use standardized terminology that lumps everything together as China, without the nuanced geographical distinctions. This isn't because Ricci learned less about the region. He became fluent in Chinese, studied local geography extensively, and traveled widely. It's because the European audience didn't need or want complexity. They wanted a simple story. There's this place called China. It's big and wealthy. We should trade with it and convert the population. Additional details about regional political divisions just confuse the narrative. The really telling part is what happened to maps published by Jesuit cartographers compared to maps from secular sources. Jesuit maps from the 1600s show progressively simplified geography with standardized nomenclature that serves religious and commercial interests. Secular maps from the same period, produced by cartographers who didn't have the same agenda, continue showing more complex territorial divisions and maintain distinctions that the Jesuits were busily erasing. Eventually, the Jesuit version won out because they had better institutional backing, more resources for publication, and direct connections to royal courts and trading companies. So the geography that served missionary and commercial interests became the official geography, and earlier distinctions got dismissed as outdated confusion rather than legitimate political recognition of actual territorial divisions. And look, maybe Cathay and China really were just different names for the same general region, and medieval Europeans were overthinking it. But if that's the case, why did the distinction persist for so long among people who generally took their geography seriously? Why do Chinese sources from the same period describe complex political divisions that align with European cartographic distinctions? And why did the merger happen so conveniently when it became commercially advantageous to simplify Asian geography for European consumption? The timing is suspicious, the motivation is clear, and the result is that we lost historical and geographical nuance in favor of a cleaner narrative that served colonial and commercial expansion, which is a pattern we've seen repeatedly in how European sources treated Asian territories: simplify, standardize, and erase local complexity to make everything easier to categorize, control, and exploit. Now let's talk about something you can actually see with your own eyes if you know where to look: buildings that don't make sense. Not architecturally ugly or why did they build it that way? I mean, structures that violate the official timeline of architectural development, show construction techniques that supposedly weren't available when they were built, or have features that nobody can adequately explain using the conventional narrative of technological progress. These are the architectural ghosts of Tartaria, and they're everywhere once you start paying attention. Mostly in former Tartarian territories, Siberia, Central Asia, the Urals, but also scattered across Eastern Europe and even parts of Western Europe, in places where these architectural traditions might have spread or been adopted. Let's start with one of the most visible and weirdest features: sunken first floors. Walk through older neighborhoods in cities across Russia, Kazakhstan, and parts of Eastern Europe, and you'll notice something odd. Buildings that clearly weren't designed to be partially underground. Grand structures with elaborate windows and decorative elements that are now half buried, with what was obviously the main entrance now requiring you to descend stairs or step down to reach it. The standard explanation is that street levels rose over time due to successive road paving and urban development. Which sure happens. You add layers of pavement and infrastructure, and eventually the street sits higher than it used to. Except when you actually measure the amount of supposed street level rise needed to account for these buried floors, you're talking about 6, 8, sometimes 10 feet or more of elevation change. That's not normal urban development. That's geological scale earth deposition. Here's what makes this particularly weird. These aren't buildings from different eras showing different levels of submersion based on when they were built. You'll find entire city blocks where buildings from the same construction period all have their first floors partially buried, suggesting something happened relatively quickly rather than gradual street elevation over centuries. Some researchers have theorized massive flooding events, widespread mud flows, or even deliberate burial as part of urban reorganization. Others point out that many of these buildings show no water damage despite being partially subterranean, which doesn't fit the flooding narrative. And urban reorganization that involved burying perfectly functional first floors of major buildings across multiple cities. That would require resources and motivation that nobody has adequately explained. So you're left with these architectural anomalies that everybody sees, nobody questions, and the official explanations don't quite add up. Then there's the acoustics problem, which is my favorite because it's something you can test yourself if you ever visit these buildings. Churches, public halls, and civic buildings from the 1800s in Siberian and Central Asian cities have acoustic properties that are frankly absurd for their supposed construction date. We're talking about buildings that allegedly were built using basic construction methods with locally available materials. Yet they have acoustic resonance and sound distribution that modern architects would need computer modeling and specialized materials to achieve. Stand in the center of these buildings and speak normally, and your voice carries clearly to every corner without electronic amplification. The sound doesn't echo chaotically. It distributes evenly, with particular frequencies enhanced in ways that make music and speech sound richer and more defined. Modern acoustic engineers who've studied these buildings are genuinely puzzled. The ceiling geometries, the wall angles, the material composition, the spacing of architectural features. Everything seems deliberately designed for optimal acoustics. But according to official histories, these buildings were constructed by frontier communities with limited resources and technical knowledge, often by local workers without formal architectural training. Yet somehow, they achieved acoustic properties that rival purpose-built concert halls designed by teams of specialists using modern scientific principles. It's like finding that your grandma's home-built chicken coop has better Wi-Fi coverage than an Apple store. The sophistication is way out of proportion to the supposed expertise and resources available at the time of construction. Some of these buildings also have proportional anomalies that architects love to puzzle over. Door frames that are unusually tall, not just high ceilings, but actual doorways designed for people significantly taller than average historical populations. Windows placed at heights that don't make ergonomic sense unless you assume different average human proportions. Staircases with step heights that are comfortable for very tall people, but awkward for anyone of normal modern height. Now, before you jump to, obviously they built for giants, there are simpler explanations. These could be ceremonial spaces designed for psychological impact rather than functionality. They could reflect aesthetic preferences that prioritized imposing scale over practical use. But they could also suggest that the buildings were designed by or for populations with different average physical characteristics, than we typically associate with 19th century Siberian frontier communities. And given that we've already discussed evidence for unusual height variations in historical populations, maybe these proportional quirks aren't as random as they seem. Field research in the Urals has turned up particularly interesting architectural examples. There are industrial buildings, supposedly simple functional structures for mining and manufacturing from the 1800s, that incorporate construction techniques that don't appear in Russian architectural manuals until decades later. Reinforcement methods, foundation systems, load-bearing designs that suggest engineering knowledge more advanced than what was supposedly available in remote frontier regions. When these buildings undergo restoration, modern engineers find themselves impressed by the structural integrity and sophisticated problem-solving evident in the original construction. This wasn't primitive frontier building. This was advanced engineering executed with precision and an understanding of materials science that supposedly didn't exist yet in those locations. The photography documentation of these structures is particularly revealing, because you can compare early photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s with later images. In many cases, buildings that looked impressive and well-maintained in early photos appeared to degrade rapidly in later decades. Not from normal aging, but from neglect and sometimes deliberate demolition. There's a pattern of architectural destruction in the early 20th century across former Tartarian territories that goes beyond typical urban renewal. Significant buildings with no obvious structural problems getting torn down, often replaced with architecturally inferior structures or just left as empty lots. It's almost like someone went through systematically removing physical evidence of sophisticated construction from regions that were supposed to have been backwards and underdeveloped. Restoration workers have the best stories about these buildings because they're the ones who actually get inside the walls and see how things were built. Talk to contractors who've worked on renovating 19th century structures in Siberian cities, and they'll tell you about finding construction methods that don't match any known Russian building techniques from that period. Joinery systems that are more sophisticated than necessary, material treatments that shouldn't be there, foundation work that goes far deeper than standard practice would require. One restoration specialist in Tomsk described finding what appeared to be ancient mortar formulations that were actually more durable than modern cement, which created problems because they couldn't match it for repairs and the interface between old and new materials kept failing. The old stuff was just too good, which is not a problem you expect when dealing with supposedly primitive frontier construction. There's also the mystery of the underground spaces. Many of these old buildings have extensive basement and sub-basement systems that serve no obvious functional purpose, not simple cellars for storage. Elaborate multi-level underground structures with vaulted ceilings, sophisticated drainage systems, and interconnections between buildings that suggest they were part of planned urban infrastructure rather than individual additions. Some cities have underground tunnel networks connecting civic buildings that official histories can't adequately explain. The standard story is that these were for practical purposes like moving supplies during winter, which makes sense for simple passages. But some of these underground systems are far more extensive than such purposes would require, with architectural details and scale suggesting they were meant for regular use by significant numbers of people. When you put all these architectural anomalies together, the sunken floors, the impossible acoustics, the proportional weirdness, the advanced construction techniques, the mysterious underground systems, you get a picture of urban development in Central Asian and Siberian regions that doesn't match the official narrative of rough frontier towns built by colonists and deportees. These are cities that had sophisticated architectural traditions, advanced engineering knowledge, and resources to execute major construction projects to high standards. Which makes sense if you accept that these regions had developed civilizations before Russian imperial expansion. Less sense if you believe the areas were sparsely populated backwaters waiting for European settlers to bring civilization. The really frustrating part is that most of this evidence is in plain sight. You don't need special access or classified documents. You can literally walk down streets in these cities and see buildings that don't fit the timeline. You can visit churches with acoustic properties that shouldn't exist. You can talk to restoration workers who found construction techniques that puzzle modern engineers. But none of this makes it into architectural history textbooks or standard narratives about urban development in these regions. Instead, we get sanitized stories about colonial expansion and frontier settlement that conveniently ignore all the architectural evidence suggesting these places already had sophisticated building traditions before European control was established. And this pattern of architectural erasure isn't unique to Central Asia. You can find similar phenomena in colonized regions worldwide. Advanced indigenous construction getting demolished or buried. Sophisticated engineering being attributed to European colonizers rather than local populations. Architectural achievements being systematically downplayed or ignored to maintain narratives of European technological superiority. The Tartarian architectural ghosts are just a particularly visible example because the buildings are still there, partially buried but too solid to completely destroy. Acoustically perfect but supposedly built by frontier amateurs. Proportionally weird but dismissed as stylistic choices rather than evidence of something more interesting. So you've got two more pieces of the puzzle. Geographical distinctions that got simplified when it became commercially convenient, and architectural evidence that suggests sophisticated civilizations in places that were supposed to be primitive. Add this to the archival silence, the linguistic manipulation, the pressured cartographers, the impossible economy, the biological anomalies, and the massive fortification systems we've already covered. And you start to see why this manuscript from 1357 makes people uncomfortable. It's not any single claim that's problematic. It's the cumulative weight of evidence that the world Mandeville described was significantly different from the world we've been taught to believe existed in medieval times. And acknowledging that difference would require revisiting and revising centuries of historical narrative built on assumptions that served colonial powers' interests rather than actual historical accuracy. But we're not done yet. There's still more to unpack about how this erasure happened, why it happened, and what it means for our understanding of history. The manuscript keeps pointing toward uncomfortable truths that institutions would rather ignore. So let's keep digging, because the deeper we go, the more interesting it gets, and the more obvious it becomes that our historical education has some serious gaps that weren't accidental. They were carefully constructed and rigorously maintained, to serve particular narratives about who was civilized, who brought progress, and who gets to write the story of the past. Now let's talk about something that should concern anyone who likes their history to actually be, historical. The deliberate erasure of an entire civilization from the geographic record happened in a relatively compressed time period, and we can trace exactly when and how it went down. This wasn't gradual forgetting or natural evolution of place names. This was systematic removal of Tartaria from maps, atlases, and geographical references across Europe and America in a span of about 75 years. And if you track the timeline carefully, you start noticing some really interesting patterns about who was making these changes, when they happened, and why certain dates keep popping up as inflection points in the great geographic rewrite of the 1800s. Let's start with 1775, because that's the last time you see major European atlases treating Tartaria as a significant territorial designation with internal subdivisions and detailed labeling. Maps published in the 1770s show Grand Tartaria, Independent Tartaria, Chinese Tartaria, Muscovite Tartaria, all carefully delineated with boundaries, major cities marked, and geographic features labeled. These weren't tentative or speculative maps. They were published by the major cartographic houses of Europe, distributed widely, and used for navigation, political planning, and education. Then something shifts. Maps from the 1780s and 1790s start showing less detail. The internal divisions get vaguer. Labels that used to specify different Tartarian regions start getting replaced with more generic terminology or just disappear entirely, leaving large blank spaces labeled with increasingly minimal information. Now, 1775 is also interesting, because it's right in the middle of major geopolitical shifts. The Russian Empire was aggressively expanding eastward. The British were solidifying control over Indian territories, and European powers were generally carving up Asia among themselves with the enthusiasm of people at an all-you-can-colonize buffet. And here's the thing about colonization. It works better when you can convince everyone that the territories you're taking over were basically empty or primitive, waiting for enlightened European management. Much harder to justify colonial expansion if everyone's maps show that the regions in question already have sophisticated political organization, established cities, and functioning governance. So maps started getting simplified. Detailed territorial designations started disappearing. And by the early 1800s, Tartaria was well on its way to becoming a vague historical footnote rather than a major geographical feature. Then we hit 1812, and things get properly weird. Because 1812 wasn't just the year Napoleon decided to have a really bad time in Russia. It was also a year of widespread fires across multiple cities and regions. Moscow burned, famously, during the French retreat. But also, cities across Siberia, Central Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe experienced major fires that destroyed significant portions of historical records, architectural heritage, and documentation. Now, fires happen. Cities burned down regularly in the pre-modern period because everything was made of wood and fire safety was more of a suggestion than a practice. But the clustering of major urban fires in formerly Tartarian territories in 1812 and the years immediately following is statistically unusual. And conveniently, these fires destroyed a lot of local records, deeds, historical documentation, basically anything that might have preserved evidence of who built what, when, and under whose authority. I'm not saying there was some grand conspiracy to burn down evidence, because that would require coordination that seems implausible, even for paranoid empires. But I am saying that these fires created a convenient reset point where new authorities could arrive, declare that all the old records were lost, and establish new official narratives about regional history without annoying contradictions from preserved documentation. It's like when your hard drive crashes and you lose all your files, except instead of family photos and tax documents, it's centuries of historical records that might have complicated the story about how European powers were bringing civilization to primitive regions. Unfortunate timing, truly. Almost suspiciously unfortunate. By the 1850s, the transformation is basically complete. Historical atlases get reprinted, and when you compare early editions from the 1700s with reprints from the 1850s and 1860s, Tartaria is just gone. Not relabeled or reorganized, actually removed. Territories that used to be carefully subdivided and detailed now get generic labels like Central Asia, or get absorbed into Russian imperial territory without acknowledgement that they used to be represented as distinct political entities. And nobody seems to find this weird. There's no public outcry about the disappearing geography, no academic conferences questioning why major territorial designations are vanishing from maps. It just happens, smoothly and systematically. As if everyone agreed simultaneously that Tartaria was never really important anyway, and we should all just move along and stop asking uncomfortable questions. What's really interesting is tracking the institutional players who made these changes happen. The Royal Geographical Society in London founded in 1830, becomes a major force in standardizing geographical nomenclature, which is a fancy way of saying they decided what place names were correct and which ones should be deprecated. Similar societies formed across Europe in the same period. The Société de Géographie in Paris, the Russian Geographical Society, the American Geographical Society, all very respectable institutions dedicated to advancing geographical knowledge. Except their version of advancing knowledge involved a lot of removing information that previous generations of geographers had carefully documented. Their conferences in the mid-1800s included discussions about standardizing maps, which sounds reasonable until you realize that standardization meant systematically removing complexity that reflected actual historical and political realities in favor of simplified versions that served colonial administrative convenience. The financial connections between these geographical societies and government institutions are fascinating if you're into following money trails. Which I am, because money explains motivation better than anything else. These societies weren't independent scholarly organizations. They were funded by governments, staffed with government officials, and their publications were used for colonial administration and military planning. So when they standardized geography, they were doing it in ways that served state interests. Maps that showed Tartaria as a distinct civilization became maps that showed Russian imperial provinces. Territories that had been labeled with local names got relabeled with Russian or European designations. And the societies tasked with preserving and advancing geographical knowledge were actively participating in geographical erasure for political purposes. The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife, though naturally nobody acknowledged the contradiction at the time. You can also trace financial flows between cartographic publishers and government ministries that tell a story about who was controlling the narrative. Publishing companies that produced atlases received government contracts for official maps, which came with implicit or explicit requirements about what those maps should show. Publishers who insisted on including outdated information like Tartarian territorial designations found their government contracts disappearing and their access to official surveying data restricted. Publishers who simplified their maps according to government preferences got steady contracts and access to the latest geographic information. It's not censorship exactly. It's just economic pressure applied systematically enough that publishers learned what was expected and adjusted their content accordingly. The market selecting for politically convenient geography rather than historically accurate geography. By the late 1800s, Tartaria had been successfully relegated to the category of archaic terminology that we don't use anymore, right alongside other supposedly outdated geographical concepts that actually represented real political entities before. European powers decided to reorganize the world's geography to suit colonial administration. And the erasure was so complete that by the mid-20th century, when people found old maps showing Tartaria, they assumed it was mythological or fantastical, a cartographic decoration rather than a legitimate geographical designation. The institutional memory had been wiped so thoroughly that evidence of Tartaria surviving in thousands of historical maps was treated as curious anomaly rather than documentation of systematic historical revision. Which is exactly what successful erasure looks like, not destroying the evidence, but making people unable to recognize what the evidence means. Now let's shift gears to something that should make historians of science lose their minds. Mandeville's 1357 manuscript describes technologies and scientific principles that supposedly weren't discovered or understood for centuries after he wrote. And I don't mean vague mystical descriptions that could be interpreted as anything. I mean specific technical details that align suspiciously well with concepts that weren't supposedly discovered until the Enlightenment or Industrial Revolution. Which raises the obvious question. Was Mandeville making lucky guesses? Was he describing real technologies that got lost and later rediscovered? Or does our timeline of scientific development have some serious gaps that nobody wants to address? Let's start with what sounds like descriptions of electrical phenomena. Mandeville talks about certain buildings in Tartarian territories that have rods extending from their highest points, supposedly to draw celestial fire or channel the energies of storms. Now, your first thought is probably, oh, he's describing lightning rods. Except Benjamin Franklin didn't invent those until the 1750s, 400 years after Mandeville wrote. But here's the thing. The descriptions aren't metaphorical or vague. He describes metal rods connected to the structure, extending above the roofline, with the specific purpose of protecting buildings during storms by conducting lightning safely to the ground. That's not mythological thinking. That's practical engineering based on understanding electrical discharge, even if Mandeville didn't have modern terminology to describe what he was seeing. Even more interesting are his descriptions of what sound like piezoelectric effects or resonance phenomena. He talks about certain stones in Tartarian temples that produce sound when struck in particular ways, with different areas of the stone producing different tones, and the sound lasting for extended periods after striking. This aligns with principles of resonance and acoustic physics that weren't formally studied until much later. But more specifically, it sounds like he's describing quartz crystals or similar materials that have piezoelectric properties. They generate electrical charge when mechanically stressed. The ancient world knew about these effects empirically without understanding the physics. But by the medieval period, this knowledge was supposedly lost in Europe. Yet here's Mandeville describing phenomena that suggest someone in Tartaria understood and was utilizing material properties that European science wouldn't formally recognize for centuries. The healing springs described in the manuscript are particularly interesting, because modern analysis suggests they weren't just natural hot springs. They were engineered geothermal installations. Mandeville describes elaborate stone channels conducting water from specific underground sources, with different springs having different medicinal properties, temperature control systems that kept water at consistent warmth, and even what sounds, like mineral extraction or concentration processes. This isn't primitive. Magic water makes you feel better thinking. This is sophisticated understanding of hydrology, geothermal energy, and mineral therapy. The kind of installation he describes would require knowledge of geology to locate appropriate heat sources, engineering to construct durable water management systems, and medical understanding to categorize and prescribe different mineral waters for different conditions. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that these weren't just legends. Excavations in Central Asian sites have found remains of complex water management systems that incorporate geothermal features, with constructed channels, regulated flow systems, and evidence of deliberate mineral concentration. These weren't accidental discovery of hot springs. These were engineered installations that required planning, resources, and technical knowledge. But official archaeological interpretation tends to downplay the sophistication, attributing these systems to later periods or describing them as simpler than the evidence suggests, because acknowledging their complexity would imply levels of scientific and engineering knowledge that don't fit comfortable narratives about the region's technological development. Then there's the navigation knowledge that Mandeville describes, which is frankly bonkers for 1357. He talks about Tartarian travelers using instruments that track the wandering star, which sounds like astronomical navigation using polar stars or planetary positions. He mentions methods for determining latitude based on sun angles and star positions, and techniques for maintaining bearing across vast distances without visible landmarks. Now, European maritime navigation didn't develop sophisticated celestial navigation methods until the 15th century, and accurate latitude determination wasn't reliable until the 1700s with the invention of precision instruments like the sextant. Yet here's Mandeville describing overland navigation techniques that imply mathematical and astronomical knowledge comparable to what European navies would develop centuries later for ocean crossings. The really interesting part is that some of this knowledge was known in the ancient world and then supposedly lost during the medieval period. Greek and Roman scholars understood principles of astronomy, geometry, and mathematics that could support sophisticated navigation. But the conventional narrative is that this knowledge was largely lost in Western Europe after the fall of Rome, preserved in the Islamic world, and then slowly reintroduced during the Renaissance. Except Mandeville's descriptions suggest that in Tartaria, this knowledge wasn't lost. It was actively used and possibly even advanced beyond classical levels, which implies that while Western Europe was having its knowledge regression during the early medieval period, other regions maintained and developed scientific understanding that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. Historians of science have this concept of lost knowledge, technical and scientific understanding that existed in ancient civilizations, but was subsequently forgotten and had to be rediscovered. The ancient Greeks understood steam power enough to build the Iola Pili, but didn't develop it into practical engines. Roman concrete was superior to modern concrete in some ways, but the formula was lost and had to be reverse engineered from surviving structures. Ancient batteries, the Baghdad battery, suggest electrical knowledge that didn't get developed into practical applications. So the idea that advanced knowledge could exist, be used, and then disappear isn't crazy. It's documented historical pattern. The question is whether Tartarian civilizations preserved or developed knowledge that was lost in Europe, and whether European powers deliberately suppressed evidence of this when they expanded into formerly Tartarian territories. What's really uncomfortable for standard historical narratives is the implication that scientific progress isn't linear and universal. We like to think of science and technology as steadily advancing, with each generation building on previous achievements until we reach our current advanced state. But if Tartaria had sophisticated understanding of electricity, resonance, geothermal engineering, and celestial navigation in the 1300s, knowledge that Europe wouldn't match or exceed until the 1700s or later, then scientific development is more fragmented and regionally variable than we acknowledge. It means that primitive and advanced are relative terms that don't map neatly onto geography or ethnicity, and that the European Renaissance wasn't bringing unprecedented enlightenment to a universally dark world, but rather catching up to knowledge that had been maintained or developed elsewhere while Europe was having its medieval period. And this is exactly the kind of realization that makes people who benefit from Eurocentric historical narratives really uncomfortable. If we acknowledge that other civilizations were scientifically advanced while Europe was struggling through its dark ages, then the story of European colonialism bringing civilization to backwards regions falls apart. If we admit that knowledge was preserved and advanced in Central Asian territories that Europe later colonized, then we have to reconsider who was actually advanced and who was catching up. The manuscript threatens comfortable assumptions about the trajectory of human progress and the cultural superiority that supposedly justified colonial expansion. Much easier to dismiss Mandeville's technical descriptions as fantasy or exaggeration than to consider that maybe he was accurately recording technologies and knowledge that modern histories have systematically minimized or ignored. So you've got a timeline where Tartaria gets progressively erased from maps between 1775 and 1860, conveniently coinciding with European colonial expansion and systematic geographic standardization by government-funded institutions. And you've got technical descriptions from 1357 that suggest scientific knowledge supposedly not available for centuries, describing technologies that archaeological evidence shows actually existed, but that official interpretations downplay. Add this to all the previous evidence, the archival suppression, the linguistic manipulation, the pressured cartographers, the sophisticated economy, the biological mysteries, the massive fortifications, the geographic obfuscation, and the architecturally advanced buildings. And you've got a really consistent pattern. Not a pattern of conspiracy theories and fantasy, but a pattern of historical revision executed systematically by institutions with clear motivation to rewrite the past in ways that justified their present power and territorial control. The manuscript sits in archives documenting a world that doesn't match the official story. And every piece of corroborating evidence, the maps that got simplified, the buildings that don't fit the timeline, the archaeological findings that get redated, the technical knowledge that supposedly didn't exist, just reinforces that the historical narrative we've been taught is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. Not because of some shadowy conspiracy, but because history gets written by whoever wins, and winners prefer stories that make them look good. Tartaria lost, got absorbed into Russian and other empires, and the victors rewrote the past to minimize what was lost. Simple as that. Except the evidence survived anyway. Scattered across old maps, preserved in manuscripts that nobody reads, embedded in architecture that's too solid to completely destroy, and documented in technical descriptions that reveal knowledge that shouldn't have existed if our timeline is accurate. And we're almost done unpacking this particular historical rabbit hole, but there's still more to cover. Because understanding what was erased and when leads to bigger questions about why erasure was necessary, and what it means for how we understand history more broadly. The manuscript isn't just about Tartaria. It's about the entire process of how history gets revised, what evidence survives despite revision attempts, and what we might be missing about the past because we've accepted sanitized narratives instead of examining the messy, complicated, often contradictory evidence that actually exists. So stick around, because we're about to wrap this up by looking at the bigger picture of historical truth, institutional manipulation, and what happens when you take old sources seriously instead of dismissing them as convenient fantasy. So we've spent this entire journey documenting how an entire civilization got systematically erased from historical consciousness. But we haven't really addressed the obvious question. Why? What was the point of all this effort to remove Tartaria from maps, suppress manuscripts, simplify geography, and rewrite centuries of documented history? Because make no mistake, this kind of systematic revision requires resources, coordination, and sustained effort over multiple generations. People don't put that much work into erasing something unless there's a really good reason. And by good reason, I mean substantial benefits for whoever's doing the erasing. So let's talk about the price of truth. Or more accurately, the profits that came from hiding it. First up, economics. Because follow the money and you'll usually find the motivation. Siberia and Central Asia aren't just empty wilderness. They're resource gold mines, literally and figuratively. Minerals, precious metals, timber, furs, agricultural land, strategic trade routes connecting east and west. These territories had value, serious value, and whoever controlled them controlled significant wealth. The Russian Empire's expansion eastward through the 1700s and 1800s was fundamentally an economic project dressed up in civilizing mission rhetoric. But here's the problem with conquering wealthy territories. It's morally and legally complicated if everyone knows those territories already belong to organized civilizations with legitimate claims to their land and resources. Much easier to justify territorial acquisition if you can convince everyone that the regions are essentially vacant, populated only by scattered nomadic tribes without formal government or property rights. That's the genius of the colonial logic. Redefine sophisticated civilizations as primitive or disorganized. And suddenly taking their land isn't theft, it's development. You're not conquering, you're civilizing. You're not stealing resources, you're putting them to productive use. And if inconvenient historical sources document that these territories had organized states, functioning economies, and established property systems, well, time to edit the history books, simplify the maps, and create a new narrative where Russian expansion was bringing order to chaos rather than destroying existing order and replacing it with imperial control. The economic benefits of this historical revision were massive. Russia gained control over Siberian resources without international pushback, because everyone's maps increasingly showed these as Russian territories without significant prior claims. Mining operations, timber extraction, agricultural development, all proceeded without complicated questions about indigenous property rights or compensation to displaced populations. Trading companies affiliated with the Crown got exclusive access to lucrative Central Asian trade routes. The economic transformation of these regions generated enormous wealth for the Russian state and connected merchant interests. Wealth that would have been politically complicated to extract if the international community recognized legitimate prior sovereignty over these territories. Then there's the political dimension, which is even more cynical if that's possible. Territorial legitimacy matters in international relations. When you conquer territory, other powers might object, form coalitions against you, or support resistance movements. But if everyone agrees that the territory didn't really belong to anyone properly organized anyway, conquest becomes much less controversial. The erasure of Tartaria from geographical consciousness served Russian imperial interests by making their eastern expansion look like natural extension into unclaimed frontier rather than aggressive conquest of neighboring states. No Tartarian Empire on the maps means no international protests about Russian violations of Tartarian sovereignty. Can't violate the sovereignty of a state that history has decided never meaningfully existed. This same logic applied to European colonial projects worldwide. The British in India, the French in Southeast Asia, the Spanish and Portuguese in the Americas, all benefited from narratives that portrayed colonized regions as primitive, disorganized, or savage prior to European arrival. Acknowledging sophisticated pre-colonial civilizations complicates the moral justification for colonialism. If India already had advanced civilizations with impressive achievements in mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and governance, then what exactly was the British Empire bringing besides military domination and resource extraction? The colonial project required rewriting history to position Europeans as uniquely advanced, bringing enlightenment to darkness, civilization to chaos. Evidence of sophisticated non-European civilizations threatened this narrative, and therefore had to be minimized, dismissed, or erased. The ideological motivation might be the most insidious because it's about psychological comfort rather than material gain. Eurocentric models of progress require believing that civilization fundamentally flows from Europe outward, that technological and cultural advancement are primarily European achievements, and that other regions were basically stagnant until European contact sparked development. This model makes Europeans and their descendants feel good about their place in history. It positions them as the protagonists of human progress, rather than just one cultural tradition among many that happen to have military advantages during a particular historical period. Acknowledging that Tartaria had sophisticated urban centers, advanced technologies, and functioning governance while Europe was struggling through its medieval period ruins this narrative. It suggests that progress isn't linear, that European advancement wasn't unique or inevitable, and that colonialism might have actually destroyed civilizations rather than uplifting them. That's psychologically uncomfortable for cultures that have built their identity around being uniquely enlightened and progressive. Much easier to revise history so that European advancement appears exceptional and justifies both historical colonialism and present global power structures that continue to benefit European-descended populations. Now let's name names, because this wasn't abstract forces. This was specific institutions and individuals with identifiable interests. The Romanov dynasty in Russia expanded the empire massively during the 1700s and 1800s, and their legitimacy depended partly on being seen as bringing civilization to backwards regions rather than conquering neighbors. Royal geographical societies across Europe, funded by crowns, staffed with government officials, standardized maps in ways that served state interests. The British Royal Geographical Society, the French Société de Géographie, the Russian Geographical Society, all participated in cartographic revisionism that simplified or erased territorial complexity in colonized regions. Trading companies had even more direct interests. The British East India Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, various Russian trading enterprises. These weren't just commercial operations. They were quasi-governmental organizations with massive economic and political power. Their profitability depended on exclusive access to resources and trade routes in regions where they could claim discovery or pioneer status. Acknowledging sophisticated prior civilizations would complicate their claims of being the first to develop these regions commercially. So they had strong motivation to support historical narratives that minimized or erased evidence of complex pre-existing economic systems that their operations disrupted or destroyed. Academic institutions played their part too, often without conscious conspiracy, but through structural incentives that produced the same result. Universities in the 1800s and early 1900s were closely tied to state and commercial interests. They were funded by governments and wealthy patrons who had investments in colonial projects. Scholars whose research challenged colonial narratives found funding difficult to obtain, faced obstacles to publication, and encountered career barriers. Scholars whose work supported justifications for colonial expansion got grants, prestigious appointments, and wide distribution of their findings. The Academy selected for research that confirmed comfortable narratives and marginalized work that complicated them. Not through overt censorship, just through the quiet operation of incentives that made some topics easier to research and publish than others. The connections between these institutions created a self-reinforcing system. Royal houses funded geographical societies that produced maps serving state interests. Trading companies supported academic research that justified their commercial activities in colonized regions. Universities trained the next generation of scholars, cartographers, and administrators in frameworks that treated European superiority as natural and obvious, rather than as constructed narratives serving specific interests. And all of this got embedded in textbooks, curricula, and cultural assumptions so thoroughly that by the 20th century, most people genuinely believed the sanitized version of history they'd been taught. Not because they were stupid or gullible, but because the revision had been so systematic and sustained that alternative narratives seemed fringe or ridiculous. The rewriting of Asian history specifically served colonial expansion by providing moral and intellectual justification for European domination. If Asia had been stagnant and backwards before European contact, then colonialism could be portrayed as beneficial modernization rather than exploitative occupation. The myth of the white man's burden, the idea that Europeans had a civilizing mission to uplift supposedly inferior cultures, required believing that those cultures lacked significant achievements prior to European arrival. Evidence of sophisticated Asian civilizations threatened this justification, and therefore had to be minimized. This is why sources like Mandeville's Manuscript, which described advanced non-European civilizations, got systematically excluded from academic circulation. They contradicted the narrative infrastructure supporting colonial projects. And here's the really frustrating part. This revisionism worked. By the mid-20th century, Most educated people in Western countries genuinely believed that Europe had been uniquely advanced, that colonized regions had been backwards, and that European expansion had been overall beneficial for human progress. The counter-narratives existed. Indigenous historians, suppressed documents, physical evidence that contradicted official timelines. But they were marginalized successfully enough that mainstream historical understanding reflected the colonizers' perspective rather than more complex reality. The price of truth turned out to be very profitable for those willing to pay it through systematic historical manipulation. And the costs were borne by colonized peoples whose actual histories were erased or distorted beyond recognition. But here's the thing about truth. It's remarkably stubborn. You can suppress it, revise it, systematically exclude it from official narratives, but you can't actually make it disappear completely. Evidence survives in unexpected places. Linguistic traces persist in languages despite official attempts at standardization. Architectural remnants stand stubbornly in cities despite urban renewal projects. Old maps gather dust in archives, preserving geographical knowledge that official histories claim never existed. Genetic markers in populations tell stories about historical migrations and interactions that complicate official narratives. And occasionally, someone picks up a 650-year-old manuscript, actually reads what it says rather than what they've been told it says, and starts asking uncomfortable questions that reveal how much of our historical understanding is based on convenient fictions rather than messy reality. Mandeville's 1357 manuscript is a perfect symbol of this principle. Truth finds ways to survive. Despite systematic efforts to dismiss it as fantasy, suppress its circulation, exclude it from academic curricula, the text persists. Multiple copies exist across European archives. It's been translated into dozens of languages. Scholars continue studying it despite lack of institutional support. And when you actually examine what it describes with open mind, rather than predetermined dismissal, you find that huge portions align with evidence that official histories prefer to ignore. The geographical descriptions match old maps and archaeological findings. The economic systems described fit evidence from other sources about Central Asian trade. The technological details correspond with surviving physical infrastructure that shouldn't exist according to conventional timelines. The traces of Tartaria remain visible if you know where to look. Language preserves archaic toponyms that got edited out of modern maps. Architecture stands as testament to sophisticated engineering in regions supposedly lacking technical knowledge. Genetics reveals population complexity that simple conquest narratives can't explain. Cartographic records document systematic erasure of geographical features that multiple independent sources had previously confirmed. The evidence exists, scattered and suppressed, but not destroyed, waiting for researchers willing to ask questions that make institutions uncomfortable and challenge narratives that serve present power structures at the expense of historical accuracy. Which brings us to the bigger question. How many other convenient versions of history are we accepting without serious scrutiny? The Tartaria erasure isn't unique. It's a particularly clear example of a process that happens repeatedly throughout recorded history. Winners write the narratives that benefit them. Complex historical realities get simplified into stories that justify present arrangements. Inconvenient evidence gets dismissed, minimized, or excluded from official accounts. And over time, these constructed narratives become so embedded in cultural understanding that questioning them seems radical or conspiratorial rather than basic historical inquiry. Think about it. How many times have you learned some fact about history only to later discover that the reality was far more complicated? How often do we discover that indigenous peoples had sophisticated civilizations that colonizers deliberately portrayed as primitive? How frequently do archaeological findings contradict established timelines only to be explained away or redated to fit existing frameworks rather than prompting reevaluation of those frameworks. Historical revision isn't some rare conspiracy. It's business as usual, the normal operation of institutions that prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, that protect established narratives rather than pursuing accurate understanding, regardless of where it leads. And this is why we need a new generation of researchers willing to be genuinely curious about the past rather than defensive of inherited narratives. People who can look at primary sources and ask, what does this actually say? Rather than, how can I make this fit what I've been taught? Scholars who recognize that dismissing evidence as fantasy is often lazier than examining why that evidence exists and what it might reveal. Historians who understand that complexity, contradiction, and uncertainty are features of honest historical inquiry, not bugs to be eliminated through selective attention and convenient interpretation. The manuscript from 1357 isn't proof of everything alternative historians claim about Tartaria. Primary sources are never perfect documentation of reality, but it is proof that systematic historical revision happened, that sophisticated civilizations existed in regions where taught were backwards, that knowledge and technology were more widely distributed than Eurocentric narratives acknowledge, and that institutions have worked very hard to maintain comfortable fictions rather than acknowledge messy truths. It's evidence that history is more complicated, interesting, and politically fraught than sanitized textbook versions suggest. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Be skeptical, not in the sense of rejecting everything or believing wild theories without evidence, but skeptical in the productive sense of asking who benefits from particular historical narratives, what evidence might have been excluded or minimized, and whether convenient explanations are actually supported by available evidence or just serve institutional interests. History isn't a fixed set of facts. It's an ongoing argument about the past, and that argument is heavily influenced by power relationships in the present. Recognizing this doesn't mean abandoning historical truth. It means pursuing it more honestly by acknowledging that what we've been taught might reflect the biases and interests of those who did the teaching. Mandeville's manuscript survived 6.5 centuries not because it was carefully preserved and celebrated, but despite efforts to marginalize it. The text kept getting copied, translated, circulated, even when institutions preferred it stayed on shelves gathering dust. Truth, it turns out, is contagious. Once people encounter evidence that challenges official narratives, the curiosity spreads. Questions multiply. More evidence gets uncovered. The comfortable consensus starts cracking. And eventually, even systematic revision campaigns can't completely suppress what actually happened. Because physical evidence is stubborn, primary sources persist, and humans have this annoying tendency to keep asking questions even when authorities insist the answers are already settled. So here we are, 667 years after Mandeville wrote his travels, examining evidence that mainstream academia spent centuries trying to minimize, finding that the world he described bears suspicious resemblance to physical evidence that official histories struggle to explain. The manuscript isn't the only source. It's one thread in a tapestry of evidence that includes cartography, architecture, linguistics, archaeology, and institutional documentation of revision efforts. Together, this evidence paints a picture of Central Asian civilizations that were far more sophisticated than colonial-era histories acknowledged, of systematic erasure serving economic and political interests, and of ongoing institutional resistance to admitting that maybe, just maybe, we've been teaching sanitized history that serves present power structures rather than honest accounting of the past. And that's uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. Historical truth is often uncomfortable because it challenges how we understand ourselves, our cultures, our place in the world. But discomfort is the price of honest learning. If you're only willing to accept historical narratives that make you comfortable, you're not learning history. You're consuming propaganda that happens to be old. Real history is messy, complicated, full of contradictions and uncertainties that don't resolve into clean stories with clear heroes and villains. It includes civilizations that flourished and vanished, knowledge that was gained and lost, evidence that survives despite suppression efforts, and institutions that prefer comfortable lies to inconvenient truths. The 1,357 manuscript sits in archives, technically available but practically discouraged, preserved but not promoted, existing as testament to the fact that truth stubbornly refuses to die, even when powerful institutions spend centuries trying to bury it. It's not a perfect document, no primary source is, but it's a valuable one, offering glimpses of a world that official histories worked hard to erase, and inviting us to question how many other convenient narratives we've accepted without examining the evidence that might complicate or contradict them. And that invitation, more than any specific claim about Tartarian civilization, might be the manuscript's most important legacy. The reminder that history isn't settled, that questions are always worth asking, and that truth has a way of surviving even the most systematic attempts to suppress it. So if you've made it this far through this deep dive into historical revision, cartographic manipulation, architectural mysteries, and institutional suppression, congratulations. You've just experienced what happens when you take old sources seriously and follow evidence wherever it leads, rather than accepting sanitized summaries. You've seen how easy it is for systematic revision to rewrite history when institutions coordinate to serve common interests. You've learned that the comfortable narratives we inherit from our education might be more about justifying present power than accurately representing past reality. And hopefully, you've developed some healthy skepticism about official histories and some curiosity about what other convenient fictions might be lurking in our understanding of the past. The manuscript endures. The evidence persists. The questions remain open. And somewhere in archives around the world, other suppressed sources are waiting for curious researchers willing to ask uncomfortable questions and follow evidence, even when it contradicts what they've been taught. History isn't dead. It's a living argument, constantly being re-examined and reinterpreted as new evidence emerges and old assumptions get challenged. The only question is whether we're brave enough to participate in that argument honestly, or whether we'll keep accepting convenient narratives because they're more comfortable than complicated truth. The choice, as always, is ours. The evidence is there. What we do with it determines whether history serves truth or just serves power.